I'm sure most of us can point to pivotal moments in our lives where a piece of art in any form of media changed the trajectory of our lives. Whether it's finding a new passion, evolving personal taste, or even learning more about yourself and how you view the world. One of these moments for me was when I happened to play Persona 5 for the very first time, which rekindled my love for RPGs. Despite adoring games like Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VII, and Final Fantasy X when I was a little kid, I phased out of the genre for a majority of my life. But after spending just 10 hours with Persona 5 during that first playthrough, I knew I was being brought back into a genre that helped me get into video games in the first place. And very slowly but surely, it's gotten me into the Persona franchise as a whole. And over the course of the last 6.5 years, I've made my way through the entire series one game at a time. And after this very long journey, I'm finally ready to share my overall thoughts on a series that brought me back to my love of RPGs. My name is Barrett Courtney, and this is my ranking of every game in the Persona franchise. Now, before we get into the list, there are a few things I want to address. First, you may know me from my in-review videos for the Legend of Zelda and Assassin's Creed series, where I dove deep into each game while reviewing them and built my ranked list as I went. To be upfront, I don't consider this to be an in-review, and the reason for that can be summed up with just one word: time. For an in-review, I would need to replay each game back to back, write my reviews, and build my list as I go. And for a series that takes more than twice as long to complete than either franchise I've done before, there's just no reasonable way I could fit all of that gaming into 1 year on top of keeping up with all of the new games coming out. The other concern I had was the length of the final video. I did the math, finding the ratio between the time to complete a series versus how long the final video is. And if I went all out and dove deep into this as much as I did for Zelda in review, a Persona in review would most likely be 9 hours long. You heard that right, 9 hours. And while Persona fans are no strangers to very long pieces of content, to respect your time and my sanity, I decided to make this more of a casual, straightforward video, where I share my overall thoughts and ranking for each Persona game. But even with that, it's still me. So while I say this is casual, like we're about to do a 10-minute Watch Mojo type of thing, we're still probably gonna be here for a bit. The second thing, obviously there are some titles in the series that have multiple versions, and to keep things simple and clean, I kept it at one version for each entry, and I'll make it clear which version I played for those titles. Though, I might still bring up the benefits of other versions when I feel like it's relevant. And lastly, it's hard to talk about these games without talking about any of the stories, so yes, spoilers will vary from game to game, though I will try to make them as light as possible. Anyways, with all of that said, let's get to my ranking of the Persona series. Number 11. Persona 3 and 5, Dancing. Now I know it's weird to start off with a tie, but I don't really feel passionately about one game over the other. The dancing spin-offs give me a lot of mixed feelings, and the existence of Persona 3 and 5 Dancing in particular really do nothing for me, despite my love for these characters and soundtracks. I do enjoy hearing remixes to 3 and 5's best songs, it's entertaining enough to see characters performing goofy dance moves, and the gameplay is serviceable. The part of me that's a percussionist finds satisfaction in being told that I'm doing rhythm good. Half of my brain sparks up seeing combo numbers get bigger, but then the other half is thinking, what the f is capitalism doing to us? I don't know. There's pretty much no story, and you can breeze through the songs in maybe 2 sittings. Despite the small motivation to get higher scores on some of my favorite songs, there's just not a lot here for me personally. I know we joke about how egregious the Persona spin-offs can be, but these games come off the most as how do we bleed more money from our audience? There's a possibility I'm in the minority here, especially after learning how many hours GameSpot's Michael Hyam has put into P3 dancing. But I just don't feel a lot of passion talking about these games, even with my love for the series. They make me feel like old man yelling at Cloud who no longer enjoys anything. Honestly, I'm sorry. I'm sorry this is the tone we started off with. Let's reset with the next game. Number 10. Persona 4 Dancing. Just kidding. Copy-paste everything I just said, but at least the slight saving grace P4 Dancing has is there's a story. It's not a particularly interesting story, and it can get quite repetitive, but it's at least enjoyable to see the cast interact with each other in a story that takes place after the events of Persona 4. Seeing them come together as a crew again, and Nanako getting to be an idol for a day, it's cute. It distracted me from my cynicism when it comes to these games, so that's why this one gets a very slight leg up on the other two. Okay, now I'm really done. Again, I'm sorry for the tone we started off with for this list, but I promise you, it's over. Let's talk about some interesting games now. Number 9. Shin Megami Tensei Persona. It's always a double-edged sword to go back to the beginning of a game franchise when you jumped into the series late. While you get to go on a fascinating journey of seeing the early roots form, you do also have to deal with the age of the game's design, gameplay, and storytelling. Persona 1 is no exception to this, with its clunky first-person dungeon crawling, a slightly obtuse Persona collecting system, and a story that is as much batshit as it is thin. But despite my hangups with the first entry in a nearly 30-year-old series, I could see the charm of Persona 1 that was striking enough back in the 90s for it to become its own series and not just a singular spin-off of Shin Megami Tensei. I got a kick out of experiencing the early iteration of talking to demons to either negotiate a contract with them or get useful items, or most often, in my case, accidentally pissing them off and making them even more aggressive. I was less sold on the extra steps needed to collect personas, and managing my entire party's personas could be overwhelming. But I did enjoy the added element of a grid system mixed in with typical turn-based combat, which made you even more aware of what type of attacks you should be utilizing and how to organize your lineup. It's not a deep system in Persona 1, but I'm surprised that it was so short-lived in the main series and wish Atlus had built upon that foundation past the first game. Now, when it comes to the story, lore, and characters, I'm in a similar spot of mixed emotions. There is some depth to the characters and their connections to each other, but the story largely never had me caring about the stakes of anything. The presentation felt a bit disconnected, with so many different ideas thrown in that it felt like Atlus was just trying to see what would stick. Though I did learn the tiniest of lore tidbits that had me theorizing about its connection to a future game, and the way the end of the story came together, ultimately being about a girl frustrated with her lack of connection to her friends and community, was something that made the journey for myself ultimately worth experiencing. My biggest takeaway from Persona 1 is that I was pleasantly surprised with how many staples of the series were solidified so early on. Granted, I played the PSP version with some visual and audio updates, but I enjoyed the pump and jams, the unique combat system, and even the thin but entertaining enough character archetypes, story, and unique setting for a 90s RPG. The main thing missing for me was a connective tissue to make all of these elements come together as one cohesive and satisfying game. The pieces are all there, but Atlus didn't quite crack the code on how to put them all together, which, for the first attempt, is honestly impressive enough. Number 8. Persona Q and Q2. Okay, I know you have PTSD from the last time, but it's not going to be nearly as bad. Also, I promise that this is the only other tie. Similarly to the last one, I didn't feel strongly about one game over the other. The Q games are both very cute, heartfelt, and have solid enough dungeon crawling gameplay if you're looking for more out of the series. The gameplay is pretty straightforward with some key differences, including adding in rows to combat to add some strategy with party placement, and of course, the big one, dungeon crawling in first person while drawing the map of each area on the bottom screen of your 3DS to keep track of chests, foes, shortcuts, etc. And real quick, I know the design of these games is more based around Etrian Odyssey, but it was interesting to play Persona 1 after I played these games and seeing the direct lineage between the two. At least the Q games control a bit better. Playing these games felt a bit like binging on some snack food. They're fun and familiar enough, albeit a bit overwhelming, long in the tooth, and not feeling like a full meal would be. That's all due to how many party members I had at my disposal, the sub-Persona system, which honestly just felt like the normal Persona system with extra steps, and how laser-focused I got on making my maps as accurate as possible. But it helps that they're presented in a cute chibi style that gives them a unique charm. And while the thematic core for both games is a little too similar for either to stand out, the real fun with these games is seeing the cast of P3, P4, and P5 for Q2 all hanging out, cracking jokes, learning from each other, and battling demons together. The original characters took a bit to grow on me, but eventually tugged at my heartstrings when I had to say goodbye to them. The Q games are fun and weird, and honestly, it's sad that I feel like they may be lost in time on the 3DS. Although, there is some hope since Atlus cracked the code for Etrian Odyssey to be playable on Switch, and with how port-happy they've been as of late, maybe the Q games will get another chance to shine in the future. Maybe get an English dub for Q2 if y'all ever do that though. Number 7. Persona 5 Strikers. Persona spin-off games over the years have come in all shapes and sizes, and Strikers definitely presents as the biggest one yet, feeling like a straight-up sequel to Persona 5 rather than just a one-off side adventure. That's proven majorly by the Phantom Thieves, who all grew a lot over the course of Persona 5 and get to show off how much they took their journeys to heart. Strikers really cements how much this group has grown as individuals and together, with moments like Haru and Yusuke imparting their knowledge onto others, and the team as a whole having to come together once again to fight against those who would seek absolute control over humanity. While the larger story at play unfortunately rehashes some ideas from Persona 5, it was hard not to fall in love with the new characters who are the driving force behind the main story. Zenkichi and Sophie are welcome additions to the P5 cast, and their personal struggles with themselves and loved ones are really the core of what makes Strikers special, especially since they both possibly have the most hype Persona awakenings in the entire series.
I am thou art I. If you yet seek true justice, we will see it done. Fine. Seal the contract.
And while the major dungeons are all a bit simplistic in design, Strikers does have one of my favorite dungeons visually in the series, and the soundtrack as a whole is such a fun backing to match the level of the high energy battles. The major thing that didn't appeal to me though was the combat. And I'll be perfectly honest, I suck at this game. I've never been a Muso person, and everything that you have to pay attention to in the heat of battle is a lot. I could never wrap my head around it in a way that felt like I could ever truly master it. Now, I'm not saying that this game sucks because I'm bad at it. It's just not particularly for me. But I still appreciate the level of integration between the typical Persona battle systems and the heavy action systems from Muso games. It was really impressive and a great marriage of both styles. While the major systems might keep me from ever doing a full replay of Strikers, the highs of story beats and character moments will stick with me for a long time. On top of its commentary on policing, fandom, and technology, Strikers stands amongst the Persona spin-off crowd as an entry that feels almost like a mainline game. Number 6. Persona 2 Eternal Punishment. The original Persona games have an interesting history, especially when it comes to being ported to the West. While Persona 2 Innocent Sin on the PS1 never got a proper release in America, it eventually came to the States with its PSP remaster, and Eternal Punishment had the opposite story. While Eternal Punishment's PSP remaster never made it to the West, the original PS1 version did get released in America, so this is all to say Persona 2 Eternal Punishment was the purest OG Persona experience I had since I had no access to a PSP remaster and had to play the original PS1 version, which came with all of its quirks from the year 2000. Cumbersome menus and UI, what felt like a tougher balancing of difficulty, no updated music, and localization that made me very confused at times. Although Eternal Punishment in many ways feels like the most aged entry in the series, there's still a lot I really enjoyed. It's the only game in the mainline series that is considered a direct sequel, and there are so many story threads continued not only from Innocent Sin, but Persona 1 as well that makes the original games feel like a full trilogy rather than just siloed entries, and it closes out this era of Persona in a way I was not expecting whatsoever. Callbacks to events in Persona 1 definitely hit me more than I was expecting, especially when considering that those moments in Persona 1 typically didn't do it for me. But the groundwork was laid out to make it all really satisfying. Seeing Nanjo return to your party in a major way, and seeing Kandori return not as the main villain, but as a pawn of the New World Order, on top of little nods here and there like a mini Deva system, the original games just come together in really cool ways. Where Eternal Punishment falters for me is how it acts as a sequel to Innocent Sin. A few major characters I grew to love were frustratingly sidelined, and while it was such a cool development to see the protagonist from Innocent Sin have his own personality in this game, since you no longer play as him here, you also have the inverse with Maya Amino. Maya is such a charming character in Innocent Sin and is the glue to that entire crew, which made it such a weird choice to me that she no longer has her own voice this time around, since she's the silent protagonist you play as. Certain emotional beats didn't hit as hard as they could have because they were missing Maya's full characterization. Similarly, since the original crew from Innocent Sin is sidelined, most of your party are minor characters from Innocent Sin that get their moment in the spotlight. They took a long time to grow on me since I was really missing the original cast, but they eventually came into their own and hit me in the emotional gut along with the characters I really cared about from Innocent Sin and Persona 1 in the final moments. Eternal Punishment had its work cut out for it, immediately following up on the cliffhanger from Innocent Sin, following up on threads from Persona 1, and tying it all together to make it a satisfying trilogy. While most of the journey felt like a retread of major beats from past games, it comes into its own by the end to deliver a solid story. And while playing the game felt a bit like a chore, and the mechanics that made Innocent Sin unique lose their charm a bit here, the highs from everything else in the game make it a great end cap for the OG era of the series. Number 5. Persona 4 Arena Ultimax. Arena Ultimax is definitely the biggest surprise I had while playing through the series. A fighting game spin-off with a crossover from two major Persona games? I thought at worst I would be getting into something on the level of the dancing games, and at best maybe something as fun as the Q games. And what I got is what I think is arguably the best spin-off in the series. Both stories in Arena Ultimax feel like true sequels to both P3 and 4, especially since this isn't some weird side universe frozen in time that the main characters won't even remember when they leave it. Seeing the P3 cast all older and finding out where they're at in life while teaming up with the P4 crew was a treat. It was the first substantial crossover I experienced in the series that made the Persona universe feel so much bigger outside of the main game's individual adventures. But who steals the show when it comes to the story is the new character, Labris, who on the surface just seems like a goofy version of Aigis with a weird Jersey accent accent, but once you learn what she went through as an anti-shadow weapon, the story flourishes with its pensive themes on what it means to be alive and what life means without relationships. I did not expect to be crying my eyes out at 1 a.m. over Labris discovering what it means to be human and her connections to the very first friend she made and a dog you never actually see. Maybe I'm a mess, I don't know, but something about her story really got to me. What holds the story back, however, is just how much of a visual novel it is. While the core of the story is really good and had me hooked even when I had to replay certain beats over as different characters, the presentation of it is unfortunately a major barrier to get over. While music cues in some voice acting helped, man, it was hard not to doze off at times. But the other reason Arena Ultimax shines is its gameplay. I'll admit, I'm not a fighting game expert like One Blessing Adeoye Jr., but to boil it down, the gameplay is just goddamn fun. Outside of Dragon Ball FighterZ, I'm not super familiar with other Arc System Works games, but with both FighterZ and here with Arena Ultimax, they bring me back to playing Marvel vs. Capcom in college with my buddies. Ultimax is flashy and welcoming to normies like me who aren't experts in the genre. Fights are fun and quick enough that I found myself putting a lot of time in just casual quick play matches. The big miss though is it felt like I was barely fighting in the main campaigns. It took roughly 10 hours to get through it all, and I think I may have been in actual gameplay for a total of like 45 minutes. Persona 4 Arena Ultimax is definitely rough around the edges, and maybe at first glance isn't really anything to write home about. But the heart and pure fun make this an entry in the series I'll never forget about, and if you care at all about either the P3 or P4 cast, I highly recommend giving this a shot. Number 4. Persona 2 Innocent Sin. I know a lot of people associate Persona 3 with where the series came into its own, and while I agree that it was a big step in modernizing Persona into what we think of it as today, the series really found its footing with Persona 2 Innocent Sin. While the gameplay is definitely a step up from the first, Persona 2 really shines in its world, story, and characters that feel much more tangible this time around to give the game that connective tissue I was missing in Persona 1. I still felt overwhelmed by the classic Persona collection/management system, but combat felt a bit snappier and focused with just a turn-based system. And additions like finding combos of different attacks from new personas to perform fusion attacks to deal major damage were super rewarding. Add to that dungeon crawling now being top-down, you can see the gameplay has more cohesion that set the cadence for the rest of the series. Innocent Sin's bright spot, though, is the story, characters, and world. It was really engaging to see the town of Sumaru react to major story beats and the rumors you could spread that would turn into reality to unlock stores and complete side quests. I wanted to follow up with certain characters over and over again to see what their reactions were to certain wacky developments. It was also heartbreaking to slowly see over the course of the story certain characters straight up disappear because their dreams were stolen from them, and it was unnerving to put together how certain rumors started. Little things like this made the world of Persona 2 feel so alive, bursting with personality while being straight up terrifying. And when it comes to our main cast of characters, they really jump off the screen and truly set the archetypes of the series for the future. The main casts are so much more personally involved in the story that I found it hard not to binge through because it made me feel more personally involved. It was also a fun surprise to see returning characters from Persona 1 not just cameo, but be major parts of the story and get a second chance at becoming more fleshed out. Stick with me here, but it kind of felt like Digimon Adventure 2, where hey, the new kids are the main focus, but also the OG kids are here, now a little bit older, to help guide the new kids on their quest. I don't know, it was a small decision that went a long way to help this world feel more connected than what I'm used to with the more modern games. But really, the story is what gets me. Kids who feel rejected that find each other, only to get torn away from one another for years and years, and the only thing that brings them back together is fate and tragedy. The twists and turns were a roller coaster, and the several emotional punches I endured were almost too much. Now, the story does get weird with rumors becoming reality, which all comes to a head when you have to fight Hitler. Yes, you have to fight a weird fake Hitler, but the weirdness is backed up by the rules set for the universe and the heart of the story and characters. And that's Persona, baby! An Innocent Sin is a really good Persona, especially with that bittersweet cliffhanger where our main characters possibly have another chance at a more happy ending. It was hard not to immediately start up Eternal Punishment right after I rolled credits. Like I said earlier, this is where the series already started to shine, and I now understand why so many fans want a remaster or remake or whatever for the Persona 2 duology. I would love to see this story and these characters brought to new life for a modern audience. Number 3. Persona 4 Golden. It only took me a couple of hours to understand why Persona 4 Golden was so beloved, not just in the Persona community, but also with people who may have never been into the series before. The quaint charm of Inaba really pulls you in with the small town vibes that are so different from the rest of the series, but showcases what makes Persona as a whole stand out amongst the typical high fantasy or sci-fi settings in the genre. Its charm doesn't stop there though, with its cast of characters, an enticing murder mystery plot, and a fun, poppy soundtrack which admittedly is my least favorite of the modern Persona soundtracks, but still eventually won me over. Similarly, I mostly found the investigation team grating when I met each of them, which was concerning when thinking about how much time I was gonna have to spend with them. But Persona 4's story is mainly about finding yourself and not letting the perception of others overtake what that is for you. Every member of your crew goes through that coming-of-age self-discovery that makes them all so lovable by the end, despite being obnoxious in their own ways when you first meet them. While that core theme in other games is usually more casually integrated into something larger like systemic corruption or dealing with the reality of everything one day coming to an end, I like that it's the core focus for Persona 4. It can come off a bit more basic compared to other games, but letting the coming-of-age stuff breathe on its own makes the end result feel more focused and able to really dig into the complicated concept of becoming comfortable in your own skin. And yeah, the story for this game can get real messy with some of the topics it swings for, but that's kind of the point. Learning who you are and who you strive to be is complicated, and sometimes you won't find your answer right away. And when it comes to the murder mystery plot, I really loved the setup for it all, which essentially turned into a Scoob in the gang, a Teddy in the gang situation, especially with all of the twists, turns, and running around hallways. Though for me, I put together who the murderer was very early on, and with that knowledge, found the build-up to their reveal to be lackluster and unsatisfying. But there are some moments afterwards that make up for it and gave me that mystery twist hit I was looking for. Now, when it comes to the gameplay side of things, it's interesting to look back at Persona 4 after playing through the entire series. With all of the different iterations of combat throughout, I've come to appreciate P4 because it's where combat finally came into its own. While P3 was the one to modernize the presentation of combat, P4 was able to marry that with an even more streamlined version of the Persona 2 combat to keep things familiar yet exciting for old fans and inviting for new fans. While the dungeon crawling feels a bit monotonous over the course of the game, and the Persona collecting is similarly basic to P3, the payoff to bigger fights is rewarding. And even though I found the social links for main characters to be a bit of a retread of the main story, the side characters really shine and help make Inaba feel even more alive. While it's my least favorite of the big three, Persona 4 definitely earns its spot as not just one of the best Persona games, but one of the best RPGs out there. Its smaller scope and quaint setting, contrasted with the wacky locations, intense battles, and heavy topics, all make for such a unique game even within the franchise. Even with my gripes, it was hard to say goodbye to this cast and this world when it was all said and done. Number 2. Persona 3 Fez. There are a handful of games I find hard to talk about when it comes to how much they mean to me, and one of the hardest games to discuss is Persona 3. The topics of P3 are core things that we as a collective people struggle with. what life means to us, and what death does to that meaning. The journey of feeling death constantly looming and either being afraid of its approach or being too willing to move on from life without making anything of it. To then finding the answer of not letting death fully dictate how you experience and appreciate life. So in death, you leave feeling fulfilled by what you were able to do with life. Death comes for us all eventually, and the only thing to overcome the fear of it is how we choose to live. Persona 3's dissection of life and death is beautiful, heartbreaking, and everything in between. Life is hard and complicated, a truth showcased so well in Persona 3 with the array of relationships that are anything but simple. Whether it's the tense history and heartbreaking resolution between Ken and Shinjiro, the complicated love that blooms between Junpei and Chidori, or the bittersweet journey of Aigis finding what it means for her to be alive in your final moments of the game. And while actually playing the game's epilogue, the answer may be a chore. What that story offers about how loved ones continue to live after death is just as bittersweet and tough to walk away from. Persona 3's story, I think, might be my favorite in the series, and its cast of characters definitely rivaled the first group of characters I fell in love with in the Persona franchise. It's tough to talk about because it highlights what is so difficult and beautiful about life. It's heavy, and there's no good way to really move on from the story to everything else the game offers. So let's just take a breath. Okay, let's talk about the rest of the game. Persona 3 is a major revamp for the franchise, while at the same time not losing the foundation that the first few games built. This was the first game in the series to add the full school year calendar system to give a clear sense of story pace, 3D graphics and stylistic UI that paved the visuals for the series moving forward, social links that flesh out characters and add even more depth to the world, and a unique soundtrack that mixed pop, hip-hop, and existential dread to help drive the sounds not only for this game, but future games as well. Honestly, everything I've talked about so far has the making of this game being my number one on the list. But even with everything I adored, this is a game I played about 15 years too late, and that definitely came with drawbacks. While I appreciate the visual overhaul and combat presentation, the decision to not be able to directly control your entire party, this being the only game in the series to do so, was a frustrating one. While you can guide your team to focus on doing certain things, a lot of the times it felt like a roll of the dice, and I didn't love that added tension. Don't get me wrong, I appreciate the swing the team took, and there are some major combat improvements, but some decisions just weren't for me. The act of dungeon crawling also felt like a major step up in presentation and control, but Tartarus eventually outstayed its welcome being the main dungeon. Though big events during the full moon were always something to look forward to help break up the monotony. And while social links were a huge addition, the first iteration of it in the series was a bit of a struggle to navigate, and I eventually just had to pull up a guide for characters I really cared about. Something surprising as well was the more simplistic Persona collection system that we see in this and eventually in 4. While I didn't miss the overcomplicated system from the earlier games, I did kind of miss talking with sassy demons. But obviously it was something Atlus wanted to take time to refine before reintroducing it into the series. Now obviously, it's hard to talk about Persona 3 without mentioning Persona 3 Portable. And while I haven't had the time to do a full playthrough of P3P myself, it's clear what the advantages and disadvantages are compared to Fez. Full party control and a great female protagonist are added on top of plenty of quality of life updates and cool social remixes, but it comes with the major drawbacks of it being a PSP game and losing the level of presentation that I feel is needed to really set the tone and scale of the story.
Persona.
Thou. From the sea of thy soul I cometh. I am Orpheus, master of strings.
As we suspected.
While I think Fez right now is the definitive version for the story, I don't blame others for preferring P3P with all of its much needed updates. If only there was a remake that would include the best of both worlds. Wait, there's one coming next year? That'll modernize Persona 3, enhance its presentation, and update combat? But wait, where's FemC? Or the added story content from Fez? We'll have to wait and see how that one comes together. Even without a definitive version though, Persona 3 is absolutely fantastic. While I definitely felt its age in the gameplay and some systems, the updates this game made for the series as a whole and the story really make it one of the all-time greats. Number 1. Persona 5 Royal. Right from the jump, you know you're in for a grand adventure in Persona 5 Royal. You're quickly introduced to the stakes of the story, the fluid combat, the dungeon sneaking, and the core vision for art design and music that ooze with style. They all bounce off of each other so well and act as a great summary for the vast game you're about to jump into. Each main entry for the Persona series has a unique vision for the flow of an RPG and all of the systems and mechanics that come with that. And what Atlus found with Persona 5, I think, is something truly special. The simple change to making combat menus tied to face buttons helps make the combat the most active turn-based system in an RPG without taking away that system's appeal. Not to mention the huge step up in other mechanics and overall presentation that all make Persona 5's combat the most energetic in the series and disproves the notion that turn-based combat is a thing of the past. And when it comes to everything surrounding the combat, dungeons being fully designed and not just the same looking hallways over and over helps drive home the theme for each major area and engages you to fully explore every inch of whatever castle, museum, or casino you're sneaking through. Dungeon crawling also takes a step up with the more sneak-based traversal that fits into the Phantom Thieves aesthetic while also making you feel more in control of the landscape you're in. I also really enjoy the inclusion of Mementos, P5's spin on Tartarus, that does have a similar level of monotony, but is slightly more engaging to get through. And when it comes to Personas, I loved the return and modernization of Shadow Negotiation, which, while a bit more straightforward than earlier games, brings back a level of engagement in Persona collecting. And to bring it back to dungeons, the synchronization between the dungeon crawling and social aspects of the game really shine, with so many captivating abilities unlocked when you spend time with people, making the core gameplay even more fun to play around with. You get to min-max the game and experience side stories with major and minor characters that are full of life, heartbreak, and introspection all at the same time. And while these gameplay additions make Persona 5 a bit more simple when it comes to gameplay difficulty compared to other games in the series, I think they are welcome improvements to help the series feel a bit more approachable. And hey, the challenge seekers still have a lot to enjoy if they look for it. And to talk more on the social side of things, it really just bursts with charm and makes you want to live in this game despite all of the horrible shit happening in it. Whether it's to hang out with confidants in a chill bathhouse, working at a flower shop to boost social stats, studying at the cafe you live above, or just exploring around for the fun of it. And that's bolstered by the fantastic soundtrack that lends itself to a multitude of moods, the UI/menu design that all have their own flavors of personality depending on which story you're in, and a complete refresh of in-engine graphics that showcase the epic journey of the Phantom Thieves on a scale that may not have been possible before. Speaking of that journey, Persona 5's story finds a great balance between the end-of-the-world stakes of Persona 3 and the smaller and more personal scale of Persona 4. While the overall journey escalates to major topics like systemic injustice, public apathy, and the scary influence of social media, the game also takes its time to paint out the very human side of these ideas to keep the story grounded, despite the fact that you go to an alternate world where you team up with monsters to fight God. Man, Persona is just Digimon. Anyways, the heavy topics of abuse, depression, and the desire to be free from the prison of societal pressure all root Persona 5's story in very relatable ways, and do a lot of work to help build to bigger-than-life moments that aren't just flash and hype, but emotionally impactful, and give each main character a moment to shine, and makes each big villain's defeat all the more satisfying. And while I do think there could have been a few places where the game could have shaved off a good 10 to 20 hours, most of it does justify the ridiculous size of this game. Now, talking about the characters and their personal journeys, while the cast and overall plot feel a bit formulaic to the series and even of itself at times, especially with this being the third iteration in the modern Persona era, the luster isn't lost due to the aforementioned themes, the Ocean's 11 heist vibe, an enticing betrayal mystery, and the fantastic performances throughout. It was easy to fall in love with each new member of the Phantom Thieves because you meet them at their breaking point, where they wake up to the terrible situations around them and decide to finally do something about it. And considering when this game came out, it really hit at the time. Seeing Ryuji and An stand up to an abusive teacher, or Futaba realizing she needs to be saved from herself, or the entire team standing up to the political leader of Japan who's willing to let the country suffer for his own desire for power, or seeing the team's ideals be tested when societal control is seemingly being used for good. It's just nice to have a story about kids standing up for what's right, and when it hits, it fucking hits. And before I move on, I've said it before elsewhere, and I'll say it here again. The late, great Billy Kometz gave truly one of the best performances in video games with Takuto Maruki that brings me to goddamn tears every time I think about it. We can have our debates about which game in the series is the best, or which Persona is the coolest or whatever, but Maruki is the best character in the franchise, and I won't hear a word otherwise. Like every Persona game, Persona 5 Royal can have its ups and downs, but the heart of it truly sings for a majority of the game. Royal really does feel what the series has been working towards since the beginning, with storytelling, world building, combat, music, and scale. The team fired on all cylinders, which makes it really hard to think of where the series could go next to top it all. How do you follow up one of the greatest RPGs of all time? Honestly, it's a question that drives the Persona team to continually follow up with something we couldn't even imagine. So I welcome the day for whenever Persona 6 comes. And that is my ranking for the entire Persona series. As a reminder, these are just my thoughts on the games. So let me know in the comments below whether you agree or disagree, and definitely leave your personal ranking, because I am fascinated to see if my list is a run-of-the-mill type of list or hot take after hot take. I truly don't know. Although I got into the series years ago, I still feel so new to it, and I'm so glad that I finally took the dive, because it really is something special. And I think it's safe to say that it has become one of my favorite game series of all time. And that's where I'll leave y'all today. If you want more of me ranking video game series that I love, you can of course check out Assassin's Creed in Review or Zelda in Review Parts 1 and 2. But until next time, I've been Barrett Courtney, and it's been my pleasure to serve you.